Brothers and sisters, welcome to this episode of The Real Deal. I'm your host, Joshua Blakeney of nonalignedmedia.com, and this show's guest is Dr. Greg Johnson, Editor-in-Chief of Countercurrents Publishing and author of the books New Right versus Old Right and Confessions of a Reluctant Hater. As someone who is a recovering former Marxist, I can testify to the stagnancy and unoriginality of the left these days, which has effectively failed to produce an interesting thinker for about half a century. The unwarranted Jewish exceptionalism and censoriousness of the left are among its many flaws, which lead it to paradoxically reinforce the interests of those in power by willfully preventing, among other things, an analysis of the impact different ethnic groups have upon political reality. Unlike contemporary leftists, much of the new right is philosophically consistent, rejects political correctness, has original ideas, and is intellectually stimulating. And luckily for us, our guest today is one of the leading spokespersons of the new right within North America. Just as the Zionist-controlled media and Zionist-controlled Hollywood demonizes Arabs and Muslims, it is undeniable that the proponents of ethno-nationalisms which undermine Zionist power are equally stigmatized. Dr. Johnson and his colleagues are scholarly and thoughtful, but the Zionists would have you believe that all those who hold their beliefs are skinheads with swastika tattoos and inflatable Hitler dolls. When I visit the Countercurrents website, I encounter classical and contemporary thinkers whose thought was entirely expunged from the university curricula I was subjected to in North America. It is my view that such alternative paradigms which are censored and suppressed ought to be discussed, which is why I'm extremely happy to welcome you, Dr. Johnson, to this episode of The Real Deal.
Thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
So why don't we kick off with you distinguishing between the thought of the old right and the thought of the new right? I imagine much of the listenership aren't familiar with your philosophical paradigm, so please go ahead and explain it for us.
Well, the term new right was really invented by the left, by mainstream leftish journalists in France in the 1970s. They used this term to describe the work of Alain de Benoit, who is the most widely published and certainly most authoritative figure in the European New Right. And the term stuck. The people who follow Benoit and Benoit himself reject it. They're not comfortable with it. But my feeling is it's a good brand, actually, and I have embraced it. I think that the idea of a new right is quite appropriate because what we stand for is a variant of right-wing thought, and it is new, and it's new in a way that's analogous to how the new left relates to the old left, if you will. So I think it's a useful term. The new right basically stands for the values and aims of the old right, but it has been updated for the post-war realities. The old right really was reacting to the old left. And by old right, what I mean is basically National Socialism in Germany and fascism in Italy and various allied movements in Europe, but primarily the National Socialists and the Fascists. The National Socialists and the Fascists were battling after the First World War against communism. They were battling them literally in the streets. And communism as a movement was a militant, terroristic, totalitarian, one-party movement that practiced genocide on its enemies. And liberal democracy simply was not up to the task of fighting and containing communism. And so after the First World War, organizations, movements like fascism and National Socialism arose in Europe, and they adopted a lot of the strategies and tactics of their enemies because, again, liberal democracy simply wasn't going to cut it. And so the old right is characterized by the same sort of one-party, militant, terroristic, totalitarian politics of the old left. And I think that those strategies were in some ways legitimate, given what they were fighting against. Yet at the same time, I think it's unfortunate, obviously. A lot of the old right was allied to the colonialist, imperialist model that was dominant in Europe at the time. The Italians wanted their colonies in Africa. And of course, Hitler looked to places like Russia and Ukraine as potential colonies for an expanding German Reich. And I don't agree with that. One of the things that I think differentiates the new right from the old right is that we are sympathetic to anti-colonialism because what we really believe in is national self-determination for all peoples. And so, I'm a believer in Ukrainian nationalism, or, if you will, Libyan nationalism, or Abyssinian nationalism. And so this conflicted with the imperialist policies that the old right embraced. But imperialism was the game. The British Empire was certainly quite a vast empire, and even though they paid homage to liberalism, it was quite a totalitarian police state in its actual operation in places like India. And it's unfortunate, I think, that the old right adopted the imperialist game, which was really the only game in town, because I think the basic ethno-nationalist principle that a lot of people have taken from the old right should make one sympathetic with the aspirations to sovereignty of all peoples around the world, including colonized peoples. So that is one of the differences. The way I put the difference between the new right and the old right in my book is that the new right basically stands for the idea of ethno-nationalism and the idea of a kind of organic society, a society that embraces a lot of critiques of class structure and capitalism and colonialism and imperialism that you find on the left, a critique of globalization and so forth, but recognizes that the best solution to that problem really is to embrace national communities, organic national communities, and to seek a world where every nation has its own sovereignty. And that, in my view, is really the closest we're going to get to a world where there's peace amongst all the peoples. The idea of one world government or large, multinational government schemes like the European Union as the way to peace, I think is folly, really. What happens when you have empires or federations like the European Union is they always take on a kind of imperial form where you have one people dominating other peoples and putting their stamp on the system. The European Union is kind of a soft form of German hegemony right now. And a lot of Southern European countries certainly resent that, for instance.
You said that to understand the distinction between the old right and the new right, you have to understand the distinction between paleo-Marxists and neo-Marxists. And my understanding is basically that classical communism, like the old right, was more militant, more violent. There was this attitude in, for example, the Soviet Union that if you were a dissident, you'd just be sort of herded into the gulag. But I think there was a realization on the left that that wasn't really tenable in the long term. And so there has been this attempt to engage in cultural subversion and cultural revolution. Whereby, yes. So this idea that rather than herding us into the gulag if we disagree, we're going to culturally change the societies of the West so ordinary people consent to their own enslavement to a kind of communistic worldview. The idea of cultural hegemony, I know, is important to you and was important to the neo-Marxists, this idea that you have to change not just the constitution of society, but the dominant ideas in society, so people feel that it's in their own interest to go along with a certain agenda. Wouldn't you say that the new right is trying to emulate those strategies and to create a new form of cultural hegemony?
Exactly. I agree with that completely. After the Second World War, after Stalin and his crimes came to the surface, The left, I think, realized that the totalitarian model was very dangerous and also really unnecessary. After the Second World War in the United States, the television industry was becoming a very big thing, and it became conceivable that leftist values could come to dominate in society simply by changing the culture, simply by changing the educational system, and so forth. And so what we have today is a left-wing oligarchical society. It's leftist in its values and in its function. It's hyper-oligarchical, hyper-capitalist, and yet all the reigning values are leftist. And that really is a tribute to the effectiveness of the New Left model of changing society through a cultural hegemony. They didn't change the underlying structure of capitalism. They certainly didn't do that at all, but they changed the way people think. And I think that the complacency today of the left about really changing the underlying structure of capitalism is worthy of comment. I think really what's going on here is we have to understand that the left is at its core a Jewish ethnic phenomenon. And what the New Left really has been, I think, it emphasizes making societies porous to groups that are previously considered others and outsiders. It's about creating upward mobility for previously excluded groups. And there are many avatars, for these excluded others, gays and lesbians, blacks, people of color in general. But really, those are just symbolic avatars for Jews, who are the primary pushers of this model and the primary beneficiaries. And so we have a society where you've got an increasingly wealthy Jewish oligarchy with these left-wing values. And I don't think there's a contradiction there at all. I think that the function of these left-wing values in society has been to make possible the Jewish oligarchy that we have today. And so it really works for them. There's no contradiction at all, I think, when you understand the ethnic angle between a left-wing oligarchical society, because it's the leftist values that have allowed this increasingly Jewish and increasingly out of touch and increasingly wealthy. The long and the short of it, as far as the new right is concerned, is yes, we think that since after the Second World War, the tendency of the left has been to rule us by changing our ideas and our culture and establishing this kind of soft totalitarian cultural hegemony, that the right has to fight it effectively, just like the old right had to fight communism effectively by adopting some of its techniques and strategies. The new right has to fight the new left effectively by adopting its strategies and tactics. Basically, what we need to do is we need to deconstruct intellectually the cultural hegemony of leftist values, and we need to create a counter-hegemony. And the counter-hegemony that I advocate, basically, is because I'm a white nationalist. I think I'm most concerned with my own people, and I want whites to survive and flourish in historically white societies. So what I want to create is an intellectual and political hegemony where basically white interests are sacrosanct. Right now, in every white country, Jewish interests are sacrosanct. I want there to be white countries where white interests are sacrosanct, and therefore the destruction of whites, the degradation of whites, ultimately, the extinction of whites will no longer be a political possibility. I'm all for pluralism. I think that what will happen in a white nationalist society on the model that I envision is there will be lots of debates. There will be debates about socialism and welfare and zoning and environmentalism and abortion and taxes and all these other things, but they will be amongst white people. And there will be no outside groups that whites will be able to ally with to gain advantages in basically family struggles with their own people. So that's the model that I'm looking towards. And yes, I'm going to be very frank about it. One of my commentators sort of called me on this. He said, look, Greg, if you're criticizing the left for a kind of soft totalitarianism, you're really advocating, admit it, a soft totalitarianism of the right. And I will cop to that. I am fully willing to admit that what we need is a soft right-wing totalitarianism, in the sense that there will be many options that people can debate and many things that people can choose, but the essential issue really to make sure that white racial preservation and flourishing and advancement are sacrosanct, those things are going to be obligatory up and down the political spectrum through every field of culture. Those interests will be as sacrosanct in the society that I envision as Jewish interests are sacrosanct in the society that we have today. So that's basically the model that I'm proposing.
Yeah, and I think it's very important to understand the advent of multiculturalism, who invented multiculturalism and what caused multiculturalism. I was recently in Tokyo, and Tokyo 100 years ago was 99% ethnic Japanese, and today is 99% Japanese. London, where I grew up 100 years ago, was 99% white Britons, and today less than 50% of the inhabitants of London are white Britons. That needs to be explained. That didn't just happen by coincidence, did it, Dr. Johnson? There's a reason that this happened, and I think it's very important for people to understand that multiculturalism wasn't just some organic thing. I mean, you hear these platitudes that, oh, these people came from the West Indies to England to do jobs that English people weren't willing to do, but there never seems to be any sort of evidence to support that. That's just cliche. So who invented multiculturalism? You did suggest it's related to the Jews. You know, obviously the Jews have their ethno-state, Israel. They've had an ethno-strategy. Dr. Kevin MacDonald's coined the phrase a group evolutionary strategy. And it seems that a segment of the Jewish population want to radically defend their right to have a group evolutionary strategy. And of course, it's sort of natural for groups to define some kind of strategy, but to concurrently foil and undermine and prevent competitor groups, be it white Europeans or Arabs, Muslims, Persians, from having their group evolutionary strategies. And I think that one reason we see international Zionism targeting Iran so intensely is because the Iranian people have created this revolutionary society where they've fused Islam with republicanism and democracy, and they've actually got kind of a fairly successful group evolutionary strategy. So would you agree with me that there's been an agenda basically to prevent groups which have historically clashed with the Jews from being successful? And how do you undermine their group evolutionary strategies? Well, you undermine the family, you promote drugs and alcoholism, radical feminism, and so on, right? Would you agree with that?
Yes, basically. I think Jews have a kind of live and let die philosophy in their relations with other peoples. If you look all the way back to their holy books, these attitudes are laid out there and given the sanctity of Holy Writ. And basically what in the United States has happened, certainly, is that multiculturalism is really a Jewish operation. The whole idea of redefining America based on universal propositions about equality and rights is something that has been pushed historically by Jews. It wasn't entirely a Jewish operation. There was a native strand of that in the United States. There's no question about that. There was a long conflict in the United States before Jews were really very powerful at all between capitalist interests and what you call nativists, people who wanted to maintain the United States as basically an Anglo society with a few assimilated groups like the Dutch and Germans and so forth, but essentially a Nordic Anglo society. That's how they conceived of America. And there were capitalist interests, though, that wanted immigration. Basically, why? Because they wanted to undermine the labor movement. They wanted to lower wages. They wanted to flood the market and basically, profit that way. And so what they did is they pushed the idea of the United States as a proposition nation rather than an ethnically defined nation. And they pushed the idea of this so-called American dream of people to come to the United States from all parts of the world to economically better themselves. And of course, the people who pushed that had an economic agenda themselves. They hoped that would economically better them, really, by making it easier for them to exploit the proletariat, if you will, to undermine wages, to undermine the labor movement, and so forth. Now, Jewish immigration really only became a big thing at the end of the 19th century, and Jews looked around when they arrived here in mass from Eastern Europe primarily. They arrived in the United States like a hacker arrives at a website. And they look around and they looked for the design flaws in the United States that they could exploit. And they saw this pre-existing design flaw, this pre-existing conflict between people who were basically defined their interests economically and were pushing the idea of the United States as a proposition nation versus the people who had an ethnic idea of nationhood. And they allied themselves with the former tendency, and they put a great deal of money and cleverness and energy behind pushing this notion of the United States as a non-ethnically defined nation. Why? Well, because if you defined the United States as a Northern European Protestant nation, a WASP nation, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant nation, Jews are definitely excluded. They're definitely outsiders. And so they warred against this identity for America and replaced it with a propositional identity based on universal rights and the desire for economic betterment and freedom of religion and so forth, because that made Jews insiders. And of course, then Jews made sure that they really, over a century, have become the ultimate insiders and really, I think, the people who control all important aspects of the American system. They're not the sole power in America, but they are a dominant group, and they definitely get their way on any issue that really matters to them. And one of the things that they have worked tirelessly for is to prevent any kind of nativist movement, to prevent the white population of America from defending itself ethnically from indigenous blacks, basically, or from the blacks that we imported, I should say, from, indigenous native peoples, especially the ones coming from south of the border in enormous numbers, and basically now from people from all over the world who want to come here. Jews basically have promoted non-white immigration and non-white emancipation in America because they believe that once whites become a minority in this country, that it will be impossible for there to be an ethnically defined nativist white movement that opposes Jewish interests to arise. And they're all very worried about things like National Socialism in Germany, obviously, and therefore they want to make sure that in any white country where they exist, and really any other country where they exist that's fool enough to listen to them and allow open immigration. Only whites have been foolish enough to do this so far, but of course they'll try it with the Japanese and the Chinese too. But anyway, they're trying to create a society where they will not experience the kind of resistance to their presence and interests that existed before the Second World War in places like Germany. And to do that, they promote multiculturalism, multiracialism, and the demographic decline of whites. And they're doing it in the United States, and they're doing it in every other European country as well. And so it's very worrisome because for me, ultimately, the only political issue that really matters is the long-term survival of whites in this world, because right now the white population is shrinking. We are not reproducing ourselves, and if you continue these trends, we will cease to exist as a race. All the causes of species extinction in the natural world apply to whites today. We're losing our habitats. We're hybridizing with other races, and if these trends are not interrupted, we will cease to exist as a race. And so I'm a white preservationist, a white racial preservationist, and that's really why I'm most concerned about issues like immigration and so forth. And I think that basically Jews are the people who are most aware of the causes of extinction, right? They're most aware of the things that are conducive to the long-term survival or long-term destruction of a group. They're very concerned to preserve their own race, and so they believe in ethno-states for Jews, namely Israel. They are campaigning against Jewish intermarriage because they want to maintain the purity of their identity. They're all for Jewish ethnic pride, Jewish education, and so forth, and yet they oppose these very things for whites in white countries. They are for open borders in white countries. They are promoting miscegenation and race mixing in white countries. They are opposed to any forms of white patriotism. They are opposed to monocultural, Eurocentric white education to pass on white identities. And the net result of this is the destruction of whites. And I think that because Jews are so aware of these issues, they're so attuned to genocide against themselves, when they're advocating policies for whites that are basically genocidal, you have to say that this is an intentional policy of genocide against whites that is being pushed by the organized Jewish community. And so this is something that I'm very concerned about, and I think really all whites need to be awakened to this danger.
Okay, well, that's really interesting and obviously some provocative ideas. We're actually at the point of the first break of this episode of The Real Deal, Greg, so we'll pick this up momentarily.
Well, great.
Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the second segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney, and I'm still here with Dr. Greg Johnson of Countercurrents Publishing. Prior to the break, Dr. Johnson was delineating or expounding his philosophical paradigm. It's obviously a perspective, a racialist perspective that's completely expunged from Western academia. If you met someone on campus at a university and they said, oh, I'm doing a graduate studies thesis on white nationalism, the presupposition would be that they were authoring that from a very hostile point of view, from a critical point of view. And so I do think, obviously, when you have a worldview that's completely eliminated for political reasons, it's important to provide a platform to the exponents of that paradigm to explain exactly how they view things in the world. I think many people who've gone through Western academia would say that, oh, white nationalism, it's the same thing as social Darwinism, it's the same thing as colonialism, as imperialism, and many people would be interested to hear you distancing yourself, for example, from imperialism, which you stated earlier that, you know, you think you support the self-determination of all peoples. If it's good for you, it's good for other peoples. So one question I would have would be, what exactly is social Darwinism, and why do you reject social Darwinism? And additionally, and this might be a sort of separate topic, but, you know, you just did mention the idea of there are blacks in North America, there are Native Americans who were there prior to the arrival of white settlers. So how would you relate to them? You know, how would your ideal world exist relative to blacks and natives and so on, people who are indigenous to the polity that we now call the United States of America?
Well, those are good questions. First of all, let me just address the issue of social Darwinism and imperialism. Social Darwinism basically is simply the idea that might makes right. And that idea is a very ancient idea, but in the 19th century, when Darwin came along and talked about the survival of the fittest and selection in that way, people started saying, well, this is the way to evolving better species, right? You have a struggle for survival in an atmosphere of scarcity, and the strongest survive, and that's somehow a good thing. I don't think that that's necessarily true. I'm an old-fashioned moralist. I follow Plato and Aristotle and natural law ethics. I believe that it is possible through reason to understand what is good. And it's often the case that the strongest party in a dispute is not the party that has right on his side. And so I simply reject the idea that the ancient sophists had, for instance, that might makes right, that justice is the advantage of the stronger, which is the phrase that you get from Thrasymachus in the first book, who is a sophist, who is arguing against Socrates in the first book of Plato's Republic. This is a very old idea. Right, social Darwinism is just a 19th century scientifically bedecked version of this idea, but I don't think that it's a defensible idea. Again, being strong and being good are not necessarily the same thing. Now, of course, it's good to be strong, it's good to be healthy, and so forth, and I think that a kind of classical Greek ethical outlook can incorporate those ideas, but the simple idea that might is right, the stronger in whatever conflict, the one who triumphs is therefore the one who is right on his side. I think that's a very primitive and peculiar idea. So I reject that notion, and I reject what it has been used to defend, which is namely imperialism. I think that a man who defends imperialism is basically telling his neighbors that he intends to be a murderer and a thief. And I know that many great empires were built by Europeans, and Europeans were very proud of them. However, I sympathize more with the people who were conquered. And the reason why I guess I sympathize with the conquered is because I look around the world that I live in today, and I see my race, my people, as basically a conquered people. A conquered people can't say no. Right? They can't say no when their enemies demand things of them. And whites are basically today a conquered people. We can't say no. We can't say no to Jews. We can't say no to non-whites. We can't say no to white misfits and cranks who are allied with Jews and non-whites. We are really in the position of a conquered people. And I sympathize, therefore, with conquered people, and I believe in a kind of old-fashioned universalism in ethics that if something is true for me, it's true for others. And notions like the golden rule make sense to me. If I don't like being mistreated by people, I don't want to mistreat others in turn. And so I think that the most ethically defensible idea is a kind of universal nationalism. This is a term that Frank Salter uses in his work on genetic interests. Basically, it's the idea that if you recognize that you would be better off if your people, your ethnic group, was sovereign in its own homeland, that it would be easier for you to live according to your historically and racially defined identity, then that's true of other people as well. If it's true for the English, it's true for the Scottish, right? And it's true for the Indians, and it's true for the various tribes of Africa and so forth. And so that's what I defend. I defend a universal nationalism. I think that imperialism is a bad thing. I sympathize with the victims of imperialism and colonialism. That said, historically speaking, I live in a colonial society. So how do I reconcile things with that? Well, the United States was founded by English settlers primarily, and some Dutch and some Swedes. And unfortunately, England was ruled by a very, very unjust political system. And there were lots of whites who were basically swept out of England through poverty, through the destruction of the old feudal tenancy system, through indenture, and they were basically slaves in the New World. My family, my father's ancestors, my paternal line arrived in Virginia in 1612 as indentured servants, and I'm just very glad that they didn't end up in the Caribbean, where they probably would have died. So, I look at the settling of the New World as something that was, in many ways, driven by an extremely evil model of capitalism. Whites were swept up into this model. Non-whites were swept up into this model. The natives were swept up in it. And, of course, African blacks were imported due to it. And the net result in North America and United States and Canada was that a basically Northern European Anglo-Saxon society was created. The Native American populations were quite sparse north of the Rio Grande, and my attitude towards them is that there was plenty of room for whites to settle on this continent. There are many things that were regrettable that took place. Both sides fought against one another, and I think that the only decent thing we can do is help maintain these people with a sort of ethnic reservation system, and that's really all that I think can be done at this point. As for the blacks who were imported here, well, they came as slaves. They were imported in large numbers. They have grown to very large numbers in North America. My desire is to create an ethno-state or ethno-states, meaning racially and ethnically defined states in North America. And I think that one of the sensible and decent things to do for blacks is to give them some area of their own. I do believe that the creation of ethno-states requires that borders be redrawn and that populations move around. I think that the ends, namely the creation of societies where different peoples have autonomy and societies where whites can maintain themselves and continue to exist well into the future, those ends are so important that the means are totally justified. I think that moving populations around and redrawing maps can be done in a completely humane way. And so that's what I'm for. So I look upon the solution in North America as basically whites maintaining their domination of most of North America. We created the system here. It's a fine system for us. The natives, I think, should have their set-asides and privileges. I think the black population, especially the people who descended from slaves, they probably need an area to themselves. I think that post-1965 mass immigration from the Third World should be simply reversed, and that over a period of 50 years or so, that all of these people and their descendants can be sent back. They could be repatriated. And so what I would like to see eventually in North America is a number of homogeneously white societies and a number of one or two maybe homogeneously black societies, and a system where there are reservations and a certain quasi-autonomy for indigenous peoples, Eskimos, Indians, and so forth. So that's what I envision. I think that's a perfectly decent and doable thing. As for immigration into Europe, Europeans are the autochthonous native people of Europe. I don't think there's any reason for there to be large non-white, non-European populations in Europe at all. And so I think that white nationalism in Europe should never give up on the idea of repatriating these people. I think that in 50 years' time, London can be as homogeneously white as it was 100 years ago, or even 50 years ago. 50 or 60 years ago, it was massively white. That can happen again. We don't need to think of this as something that has to be accomplished overnight. There's a lot of negative and I think destructive revolutionary fantasy literature, like the Turner Diaries and things like that, where people imagine some quick, violent explosion of ethnic cleansing or something like that. I think that's unattractive. I think that turns a lot of people off, and I think it's unnecessary. White demographic displacement was something that was carefully and slowly engineered over decades, over generations. And I think that it can be undone over decades, over generations. I don't think we need to be in such a big hurry over it. And I think that as long as whites know that things are on the right path again demographically, that's going to be a huge boost in our morale anyway. And I think that, in 50 years' time, we might have homogeneously white societies all over the globe, and that there will be no danger in the future of whites dwindling down and disappearing through low birth rates, replacement birth rates, hybridization, mass murder and things like that, which are things that we really are threatened by today.
The ethno-state, as I said, that I'm most familiar with is Japan. And one thing you notice in Japan is everything's sort of high quality. And it could partially be because Japanese have a very high mean IQ. But it seems to me that one of the positive sides of ethno-states, and I would say that, multicultural states have their pros and cons, and ethno-states have their pros and cons. But one of the tremendous positive sides of Japan is that the ruling class sort of feels shame. And you see, for example, with the Fukushima disaster, the CEO of TEPCO comes on the TV screen and he's almost crying and he's bowing and he feels ashamed. We're ruled currently by people who have an ideal of chutzpah, shamelessness, which is why I think you see this McDonald's junk culture, especially in North America. So I was going to ask you, what if a cynic said, Greg, why is it so important to preserve the white race? Why, in your opinion, does this matter? I mean, you're proposing things like repatriation, which would cause, no doubt, some upset in certain communities. And so you have a choice between sort of two wrongs here, the loss of the white race or uprooting those people who are settled in formerly white societies. Why should I care about the loss of the white race? What would you respond to someone who would say that?
Well, why should we care about the loss of the Jewish race? If somebody raises that question, they can be thrown in jail all over the world. Why should we be concerned about the loss of the Ainu or the Japanese or any other group? Why should we be concerned about the death of Bengal tigers and exotic birds and so forth? It's a unique aspect. Only whites have that question lobbed at them. Why should we be concerned about your extinction? Right? Somebody simply has to say there's a grave danger that the northern white rhino will cease to exist in a few years, and there are people writing checks, and demanding something be done. No one says, would it be really a tragedy if the northern white rhino ceased to exist? Are they really so different from the southern white rhino? No one says that. They only say that about whites. Okay, so that's the first thing I need to register. So if we're just going to be sort of detached about this, right? Disinterested, and just talk about the death of a particular race, even if it's our own, in a disinterested way. Only whites are being asked to be disinterested about their long-term survival. I think that's rather extraordinary. That indicates in itself that the culture, that the dominant ideas are rigged against us, right? When people say this, they're simply responding to their sense, their little spider sense, right, of what's permissible, right? No one ever says, because everyone knows it's permissible, why would it be a disaster? When somebody like Alan Dershowitz sounds the alarm about Jewish intermarriage and says Jews are going to cease to exist as a people, people are somehow sensible enough not to say, well, would that really be a tragedy if Jews cease to exist? People know better than that. but it's fine to say that about whites. And I want to change that cultural hegemony, that consensus that makes that question raisable. And raisable from whites. I mean, a lot of whites will say this. Isn't it our turn, maybe? I mean, let's be good sports about it. We had our day. That kind of disinterested attitude towards our own existence is a decadent, devitalized, alarming idea that's being pressed upon us. And I think that, underneath all of our programming, our cultural programming, and this disinterested idea that we can somehow contemplate with equanimity our own demise as a race, there's still an organism there, right? We're still animals. And every animal, every healthy animal, strives to maintain its existence, strives to reproduce itself. I think we need to get whites in touch with our healthy animal natures again. And I think that's the first thing. The ultimate reason why I'm concerned with the survival of the white race is simply because it's my race. It's my people, right? Now, I could say things like, well, I do think that the white race brings incalculable gifts to the universe. That's true. I can say things like, the white race is the race that's concerned with preserving tigers and rhinos and elephants and rare flowers and things like that. And that is true. I do think that we have brought great gifts to humanity in terms of our culture, our political systems and things like that. I think the world would be very poor without whites. But that's really trying to put this in an altruistic, universal sense. That's fine, but ultimately for me, even if we were the sorriest bunch of people on the planet, even if we were as dumb and ugly and uncultured as the most primitive peoples on the planet, I'd still want us to continue to exist simply because it's us, it's me, it's our identity. And as a healthy organism, that's my birthright, okay? It's my birthright to strive to perpetuate myself and my people. And the idea that we have to listen to people saying, well, would it be such a tragedy, is the thing that I reject. I want to live in a world where people don't dare utter that notion, not because we're going to haul them off to the gulag or something like that, but simply because there's an understanding that's simply not a permissible thing for a healthy organism to contemplate.
Yeah, and the way you talk today is heterodoxy, is heresy. But there was a time not so long ago, a couple of generations ago, where discourses like the one you deploy were very mainstream. And one thing Countercurrents has done, which I very much appreciated, is to republish many of the thinkers of the old right, whom I, for example, as a sociology student at university in North America, wasn't presented with to read. People like Evola and Pound and Schmidt and Yockey, Spengler. So why don't you talk about those upon whose shoulders you're standing right now, the people who provided you with a kind of philosophical underpinning in the last 5 minutes before the next break?
Well, I'll make it really brief. The fact of the matter is that the multicultural establishment ideology that rules today is completely out of sync with Western tradition. It is aberrant and insane from the point of view of the Western philosophical, political, cultural tradition. There's no serious thinker who ever argued that diversity and multiculturalism are strengths. Okay, it was simply understood by people like Plato and Aristotle and others that diversity, faction, anything that introduces division into a society is ipso facto bad. And so the idea that somehow multiculturalism represents the acme of sophistication is just absurd. It is an aberrant, insane idea. And most of the Western tradition consists of people who are, by today's standards, right-wing extremists. In their time, they might have been on the left. John Stuart Mill would be a right-wing extremist in today's university, and yet he was a leftist in the 19th century. So really, one of the projects of the Counter-Occurrence North American New Right publishing house and webzine is simply to recover our tradition and for us to recognize that it is the Western tradition that we stand on, the entire Western tradition. Not just a few, 20th century thinkers who are a little out there like Ezra Pound, right? I mean, he was a great poet and everything like that. But we stand on the whole Western tradition. It's on our side. And the people who are running the universities today are basically opposed to Western civilization and Western culture, and they're increasingly open about it. That's what has to go. So we are the exponents of Western civilization. We are the people who will make it survive. The academy today, the university today, the establishment today is out of sync with and really on a collision course with Western civilization. It's slated for destruction along with our race, and we want to stop that.
Okay, well, I think on that note, Greg, we'll go to the second break of this episode of The Real Deal. I hope the listenership are enjoying this very, original analysis. I mean, like you say, there is a strong tradition which is consistent with what you're espousing, but unfortunately in this day and age, you're sort of on the fringes, unfortunately. And so I'm very pleased to be able to enable you to disseminate your message. But we will go to the second break now, ladies and gentlemen, and we'll be back shortly. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the third segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney, and I'm still here with Dr. Greg Johnson, author of New Right versus Old Right and Confessions of a Reluctant Hater. Prior to the break, Greg had been explaining exactly why, for example, it's important in his view that the white race has longevity and it doesn't succumb to deracination and multiculturalism and so on. He also stated that he was with the colonized and opposed to the colonizers, opposed to imperialism. And obviously some would say we're living in the era of Israeli empire. We're living in the era where the sort of Zionists have taken over the American empire, and that the war against the people of Iraq, the wars against the Muslim world are being spearheaded by Zionists using the largely Gentile troops of the American military, and now Canada's military is bombing Iraq as we speak. So where do you stand on the Israel-Palestine question? One criticism I have of your movement, Greg, is that I perceive many members of your movement who live in countries like I do where there's hate speech laws. They say, okay, well, it's illegal for me effectively to criticize Jews and Jewish power. And so I'm just going to spend 90% of my time parroting Zionist propaganda against Muslims because that's okay and that's acceptable. And people like Nick Griffin can get votes by doing that and get traction. And it seems that there's this kind of odd Stockholm syndrome almost, where the people who have innovated the anti-white policies are the people whose propaganda much of the white nationalist movement parrot vis-a-vis Muslims. And, especially when you look into like terrorism, the phenomenon of terrorism in the West, and the reality that often, Mossad agents and there's Israeli tentacles on these incidents, and often there's allegations that terrorist incidents aren't completely organically emerging from the Muslim world, but are actually Israeli false flag terrorist operations. It just seems very redundant and very disingenuous for white nationalists to parrot Zionist propaganda. Is that a fair perception that I've just espoused, Greg?
Joshua, those are good points. Those are good questions. And it bothers me when I hear people who are on my side basically parroting what sounds like neoconservative talking points. However, ultimately for me, what's most important is my people, their freedom. And yes, Jews are a major problem in the West. They are the architects of multiculturalism. They are the people who are leading us off to various wars around the world, especially in the neighborhood of Israel and so forth. Yet at the same time, Islamic colonization in Europe is a huge problem. And therefore, a lot of the things that people are saying that sound like neocon talking points really are relevant to what's going on in Europe. And I've been very, very sensitive when I look at these anti-jihadist sites and things like that to see the fingerprints, if you will, of some kind of Zionist control, whereby people are being distracted away from the Jewish angle to focus entirely on Islam. I think that we don't have to choose between the two, though. We have to take our own side on this. We are not forced to take sides with Jews or Islam. Okay, they want to pose things to us in that way. I don't think that we have to take that deal. I think that in the end, we all have to take our own sides on this. I'm sorry, somebody has started up some leaf blowing or thing outside. Is that going to be a big problem?
It's okay. It's okay. We'll just soldier on.
We'll just soldier on.
Yeah, so like white Europeans, as you've explained, are sort of seemingly being targeted by the Zionists, and you referred to us as a conquered people, which seems, in my view, to be largely accurate. But also Arabs and Muslims are being targeted. And in a way, we're sort of worse off than Arabs and Muslims because they still have the patriarchal family. They still have a certain element of organic unity. And in some ways, we can sort of learn from the Muslim world, I think. And so there are those who would say that it's surely sensible for a white Arab or white Persian or Christian Muslim alliance against our shared oppressor. Like, what's the use of us? I mean, you say we don't have to choose between being friends with Israel or being friends with the Muslim world, but I think it's just a sort of logical thing, seeing as we're both undergoing this Frankfurt School destabilization and cultural subversion, and Christian whites are being asked to go and fight Muslim Arabs and vice versa. Muslim Arabs are being equipped seemingly by the Israeli Mossad to come and do terrorist attacks against our people in the West, that we sort of rise above this and unify and try to defeat international Zionism between the hammer of white European Christian society and the anvil of the Ummah, of the Muslim world. Because, most Muslims aren't terroristic. And an addendum I'd like to add to that is that Israel's foreign policy is the Oded Yinon plan, namely the attempt to destabilize the Middle East. And so any support for Israel would, by definition, be producing millions of Muslim refugees. I mean, I think there's 2 million refugees produced by the destabilization of Syria, which was a key component of Israeli foreign policy to undermine one of the few governments in the Middle East that doesn't consent to Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. So it seems that and you haven't really sort of explained your full position on Israel yet, and I'll let you do that in a minute, but any support for Israel would be effectively helping to facilitate the further destabilization of the Middle East, which will produce more Arab and Muslim immigrants to Europe and to North America, and that the presupposition for any support for Israel would be that really the Jews just want this peaceful, quiet little Jewish state in the Middle East that leaves itself to itself, and it's only these nasty, crazy Arabs who are targeting it, which is causing the problem. But the reality is we know that Israel has schemes against the Palestinians that it's implementing. It has regional agendas, and it also has global agendas. And therefore, it seems to me that Israel will never be anything but a headquarters for international Zionism, which means, therefore, that we have a vested interest in supporting those who are resisting Israeli hegemony in the Middle East. Does that make sense?
It makes sense in this sense. First of all, I want Jews out of Europe and out of America, and that means that they need to go somewhere. And so I like the idea of a Jewish homeland, and I think the fact that there is a Jewish homeland already on the ground, up and running in the Near East, is something that we should just accept and work with. So I think that the ends justify the means in this case. I think that it would be great if the Zionist project were completed. I think that Israel is such a big problem, of course, because Jews are a very aggressive people and they're going to try and get whatever advantages they can. I think they would be less of a problematic people if they did not have the ability to throw the weight of the United States and through the United States, NATO and other countries behind them in their struggles. So let's just imagine a world where Zionism is completed, where Jews have left Europe and the United States, and the United States and Europe is not under effective Jewish foreign policy control. Therefore, Israel would have to try and be a better neighbor, I think, because they simply would not be able to have the United States and Europe fight wars for them. And I think that they would suddenly find it more in their interest to be a little less of a bad neighbor and a little less of a destabilizing force. That's what I hope. Okay. In terms of the Muslim populations that are currently in Europe and the United States, I'd like to see them repatriated as well. I'd like to see the refugee Palestinians repatriated, and that means I think there should be a two-state solution, that the Palestinians should have their own state. I think that a lot of the instability in the region is caused by the fact that, again, Israel can count on the United States to fight for it and to enable it to destabilize its neighbors. I think that if Israel could not count on that, they would have to have a less bellicose and belligerent relationship with their neighbors. They wouldn't be great people to have around. That's why I want them to leave the United States and go there. I have to say I wouldn't wish Israel on my worst enemies as a neighbor, and yet for the for very sound real politic reasons, I want the Israeli state to exist, and I want Zionism to be completed. Does that mean that I'm anti-Arab or anti-Muslim? No. I want them to keep their ummah. I want to keep them to keep their part of the world. I want Europe to maintain itself, and I don't see any reason why we need to fight. I think that there's been a history of conflict. I think that there is an imperialist, universalist impulse in Islam that has been a problem in the past. I think that the West is strong enough, if we get our heads screwed on straight and if we stop listening to multiculturalists and Jews, that we can be completely secure against that in the future. I don't think that that is really a threat. And I would like to see that kind of amicable and peaceful world, in that kind of settlement. And I think it would be enormously advantageous to whites, and that's the primary group that I'm thinking of. I think that if Israel were somewhat pacified and did not have the United States fighting its battle while it gallantly holds our coat, that it would be less of a bad neighbor. I'm not going to claim that they're ever going to be a great neighbor to be around. But that's sort of the best I can offer from the point of view of a self-interested white person. And yes, it is something of a contradiction. I tend to sympathize with the colonized. I sympathize with the Palestinians. Why? Because we're both under Jewish occupation. And I admire the Palestinians because, unlike my own people, they're fighting back, right? Yet at the same time, I would like the Israeli entity to continue to exist and to be the homeland for all the world's Jews. I think that would be a really good deal for white countries where they are the primary problem. So anyway, that's sort of my outline of the situation.
Yeah, you came up with this phrase, the completion of the Zionist project. But, that kind of requires defining, because there are some who say, well, the completion of the Zionist project is the complete expulsion of the Palestinians, as I say, the destabilization of the Middle East, the creation of ethno-statelets in the Middle East, permanent strife, permanent ethnic conflict, so the Arabs and Muslims and Persians are squabbling amongst themselves, so they're not fighting the Zionist cuckoo in the nest. And so don't you sort of owe us a definition of the completion of the Zionist project? Because, as I say, this idea that it's just going to be a tiny little quaint Jewish state that keeps itself to itself. And then there's the whole issue of Al-Quds being occupied, the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is, I think, the third most holy site in Islam, being occupied by Zionists. You say realpolitik, but from an Arab, Muslim, Persian perspective, how is the existence of Israel ever going to be anything other than an aberration and intolerable? Lady Michelle Renouf, I'm sure you're familiar with, she has drawn attention to the Jewish autonomous region in Russia. And it sounds sort of like, way out there, like a radical, bizarre theory to come up with. But she has suggested that, yes, Israel doesn't have a right to exist. Yes, we have this problem, obviously, with Zionists controlling our government. And she has said, well, the Jews prior to 1948 already had an ethnic Jewish zone, the Jewish zone in the far east of Russia. I've often wondered whether that might be one way to overcome this issue. So don't you owe us an explanation? Because, it seems to me that Israel, regardless of whether or not Israel controls the US government or controls the British government, they're pushing to be the number one hegemon on planet Earth. They don't have just like regional schemes. It seems that what's going on in Ukraine right now has a lot to do with Israel. That they want to be a global empire. It's a new world order that they're trying to establish. And some would say, therefore, it's kind of naive to say the completion of the Zionist project as if it's just to try and create borders within the river and the sea, that they want to push for global hegemony.
Well, I understand what you're saying. I have a sort of not in my backyard attitude about the Jewish state, obviously, and I totally understand why the Muslims say yes, but not in my backyard either. Unfortunately, it's in their backyard, and I kind of think that it's more likely to stay there, given that they have a mountain of nuclear and biological and chemical weapons that they're sitting on. I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon. I think, though, that the idea that Jews simply with Israel could be, have global power is not very likely. Israel would be a small, crowded country with a lot of weapons, but I don't think that without its ability to influence U.S. and European policy, that it really could project global power. I think it would be a kind of Switzerland in the Near East. No offense to the Swiss, but by that I simply mean a small, well-armed kind of fortress in the Middle East, but by the completion of the Zionist project, what I really mean is the idea that Jews will have their own state and that they would all live there. Okay, that's all I mean by it. And, Herzl and other Zionists really had the idea that Jews need to be a normal people, meaning that they can't just occupy economic niches in other people's societies, but they have to create their own society where they occupy all the economic roles, where they actually have to do manual labor and things like that, where they can't just be middlemen. And I think that is a noble idea, and I would like that to happen. I think that if something like that did happen, that's really the best solution to the Jewish problem, certainly from the point of view of Europeans, because although of course, it's Israel's neighbors that are taking a real beating in terms of wars and revolutions and things like that. These people are in no danger of long-term extinction, right? And I do think, however, that Jewish hegemony in European countries it manifests itself in less, overtly warlike and bloody battles. There are no mushroom clouds or phosphorus bombs, over European cities yet. But the long-term demographic trends, largely engineered by Jewish power, are quite ominous for Europe. Okay. And so, who has it worse, the people in Gaza or the Europeans? Well, in terms of, heart-wrenching images of bloody children and things like that, Gaza has it hands down. But in terms of long-term demographic prospects, Palestinians, Muslims, Arabs, Persians, those people aren't in any danger. They have their homelands. Except for the Palestinians, of course. A lot of them have homelands. They have healthier societies, intact families, and things like that. I think that they have it good compared to Europeans in a lot of ways. Doesn't mean I'm not sympathetic to them, but I'm more sympathetic to my own people. I do recognize that there are inevitable conflicts between people, and I think it's unfortunate that Jews are pitting currently pitting Europeans against Muslims and using each group to attack the other. Americans, British, people like that are attacking Muslims in the Middle East, in the Near East. There's no question about it. And that's engineered by Jews. Jews have also engineered the Islamic colonization of Europe, in which the demographic long-term future of Europeans is being threatened by Islamic colonization. They are pitting both groups against one another for their own advantage. I think that we do have we do have conflicts of interest, but we also have a common interest, I think, in preventing that situation, that scenario from continuing. But in terms of my long-term vision of how I'd like this to play out, the Zionist entity is still going to be there, right next door, I hope, to a prosperous and secure Palestinian state. That's really, for me, the best I can hope for. And I know that that's, sounds very utopian, and give peace a chance, and I'm very, very aware that Jews will not play by those rules as long as they have the power to throw Europe and the United States into fighting their battles. I think that if we can stop that, if we can raise awareness of how Jewish power works in the world, that we can undermine their power to pit European societies against Muslims, and I think we can also undermine their power to use Muslim colonization against Europeans. So.
And you've criticized the French new right thinker Guillaume Fay, who has proposed that white Europeans build an alliance with the Jews against Islam. You've criticized that viewpoint, which is sort of embodied in the philosophy of these Zionist-sponsored groups like the EDL, for example, right?
Yes, I look at people like Fay, and I look at people like Wilders and others who are primarily anti-Islamic and want to be pro-Jewish, and think that Jews who have approached them and said, we have common interests with you, we should ally, we should be friends, you should stop criticizing Jews and focus on the Muslim issue, and we will, we'll give you better press or whatever they're promising. I think that that's folly. I do not believe that Jews feel threatened by Muslims in Europe. I think that the idea that there can be an alliance between the European ethnic right and Jews in Europe on the grounds that Jews are threatened by Islamic colonization, just like whites, is folly. It's foolish. And the main reason I think that is that Jews chose to put their ethno-state in a sea of Muslims. They are less afraid of Muslims than they are of Europeans. Okay? I think we have to understand that. Jews are less afraid of Muslims than they are of Europeans. And Jews consistently support Islamic colonization in Europe. Why? Because they think that Europeans in Europe are the greater enemy. They feel more secure in a Europe where white Europeans are becoming a minority and are constantly on the ropes because of the turmoil caused by massive influx of non-whites into Europe. Jews feel advantaged by that. And if they were afraid of that, and if they wanted to change the Islamic colonization of Europe, they would not need to ally themselves with marginal European nationalist parties. They would be on the phone, their leadership, right? They would be on the phone to the leaders of all the major parties and to the people who run the major press outlets. And overnight, there would be an instant consensus that Islamization has to stop. It would be a consensus up and down the political spectrum. It would be the mainstream consensus being barked out by all the media outlets, because that's what real power allows them to do. They have real power in Europe right now, and they do not need to ally themselves with marginal nationalist parties to fight Islamization if they were really concerned with that. So the question that I always have is, if they don't need an alliance with people like Guillaume Faye and people like Geert Wilders and others like that, why are they there? What are they after? What they're after is they're after the neutralization of European nationalists on the Jewish question. They are there simply to retard discussion of the Jewish problem in European nationalist circles. And that's the only reason they're there. And I think that we have to resist this kind of Jewish subversion, because that's really what's going on. It's simply the Jewish subversion of European nationalism under the guise that a few Jews are worried somehow about Islamic colonization in Europe. They're not. It's a ruse. That's my basic position on this matter.
Well,
now, go ahead.
We're at the point of the third break, unfortunately, Greg. So could you hold that thought until after the break, please?
Sure.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go to the third break of this episode of The Real Deal, featuring Dr. Greg Johnson of Countercurrents Publishing. We'll be back momentarily. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, welcome back to the fourth and final segment of this episode of The Real Deal. I'm still your host, Joshua Blakeney, and I'm very pleased to still be here with Dr. Greg Johnson. Prior to the break, Greg was providing his analysis of the Israel-Palestine quagmire. He did suggest that he supports the existence of Israel, but only out of a sort of realpolitik tactical perspective, putting white interests first. I still come back to this point, Greg, that although, as you've suggested, the idea of a white European alliance with Jews against Muslims is a bad idea, is inorganic, is inauthentic, that there is surely room for a white Arab alliance. And we see the black French comedian Dieudonné, he's been criminalized and persecuted in France for cracking jokes about the Zionists, which is not allowed in French society. But we see white people, many who are perhaps interested in historical revisionism. Dieudonné, of course, is friends with Dr. Robert Faurisson, linking arms with dispossessed blacks and Muslims, many of whom come from the former French colonies, places like Algeria. And recently I saw even in the Front National in France, there was a member who had converted to Islam. So isn't there surely room for some kind of Arab-white alliance? Is there any room for that in your analysis?
In the short run, tactically speaking, yes, I think so. And in the long run, sort of globally speaking, yes, but in the sense that what I would like to see is I would like to see the European world and the Muslim world living at peace with one another without populations transferring, without Islamic colonization of Europe, without American bombers dropping bombs in the Muslim world and so forth. I would like to see those two civilizational blocks to exist with neatly delineated boundaries, living at peace with one another. Okay. So in the short run, let's talk about Dieudonné and people like that. I am totally in favor of people like him. I totally understand why people whose primary concern is calling out Zionist power, Jewish power, are willing to make alliances with people all over the world, non-whites and whites alike, in order to do that. I think that's logical. I think, though, that we have to, in the long run, recognize that the best interests of all of our peoples is to have our own separate spheres. That's the only caveat that I want. I will engage in this kind of tactical alliance with the understanding that, as long as it's very clear, as long as everybody understands that, in my view, it's best for us to have our separate civilizational spheres. I tremendously admire Dieudonné. I think he's incredibly funny, obviously extremely intelligent. I think that it's very important to mock the enemy. Jews have been very, very effective at mocking us, mocking Muslims, mocking whites, so forth, especially mocking WASPs, which sort of hits me close to home. And I think it's great to mock them back because they are certainly a soft target for mockery, and their hypocrisy is legendary. And Dieudonné is great. I love his Mahmoud sketches that are on YouTube. I think those are brilliant, where he goes to Iran and he's talking about Ahmadinejad and his experience with him, where he goes and he visits Khorasan, and he's acting like a scared little bourgeois mouse, in the presence of somebody who's a radical. And when he does that, it's brilliant because it really makes the people in the audience aware of how they are controlled by ignoble forms of fear. So I think he's a genius. I think he's brilliant. I love it when people like Soral and others stand with him. I think that, they might have different visions of what the ideal society is. And so down the road, we might have a parting of ways and a settling of accounts, right? But in the present state, I am all for them. I want to encourage them. There's this Talmudic saying, or it's been attributed to the Talmud, and one of the things that I've learned is practically everything that I've heard in sort of white nationalist movement circles needs to be checked before I quote it. So I probably shouldn't be quoting it, actually, because especially stuff that deals with the Jewish question, there are a lot of people like Eustace Mullins, who had no qualms about just making stuff up. And I think that's very bad for our cause, because I think truth is on our side and the truth is definitely enough. But anyway, I was told by somebody that the Talmud says that there's this little saying that even more than the farmer needs the milk, the cow needs to be milked. And that's true of cows, right? Even if you don't need the milk, you have a milk cow, it's got to be milked, right?
Yeah.
But, the sinister reading that was given this was that it was basically the idea that even if it's not in the interests of Jews in any definable way to basically be, besetting the goyim with, radical movements and causes and controversies and things like that, even if these things don't really redound to Jewish interests in any, immediately understandable, definable way, it still has to be done. Why? Just to keep them on the ropes, just to keep their heads spinning, just to keep them constantly, fighting for air. It's that idea that one of the ways that they control us is by just constantly, keeping us distracted, keeping us bothered, keeping us up in arms. And I have the same attitude about Jews. I think that even though in the long term, I want Zionism to triumph in the sense as I specifically defined it, namely, I want all the Jews to be in Israel, in Israel to be a little Jewish Switzerland at peace with its neighbors and unable to make the United States fight its battles. Okay, even though I want that, I want the cost of Zionism to be very, very high to them. Why? Because the more energy that they are putting into maintaining that, the less energy and money they're spending on suppressing my people and my interests. Okay, and so even if somebody like Dieudonné might not, be on board with my white nationalist agenda or something, more power to him. I want him out there. I want him bedeviling these people because they're my enemy right now. And the more bedeviled they are from all sides, the weaker they are in bedeviling us and bedeviling me. And so I look at it just that way. The more mischief, the merrier in this kind of setting. And, Jews are, they're a very powerful people. They're a very wealthy people, but they are a very small people, in terms of absolute numbers. And I used to think that they were hyper paranoid and that basically in the United States, for instance, practically everybody was on their side. And then I I came to think that I was mistaken on that matter. I was living in Berkeley, California, at the time of the the run-up to and the opening couple years of the Iraq War, the 2003 and on war. And I was surrounded by a lot of Gentile leftists, people who were, white left-wingers who were opposed to this war, and they were puzzled. They were puzzled at where was the left-wing media. They felt that the peace movement was not given the kind of respectful treatment that, say, it was given during the Vietnam War. And there were people who basically were very frank about this. I was frank about this to some of my students who asked me this question. But I encountered Gentile leftists, people in their 50s and 60s who had been involved in the left for their entire adult lives, who would basically say, what's going on here is, Jews want this war, right? Mm. And they were totally aware of how Jewish power works and how Jewish power in the peace movement and in the media was was basically causing the anti-war movement and the left to pull their punches because Jews wanted this war to happen. I was astonished at the number of people who were aware of this. Okay, astonished. I was not the one who was bringing it up oftentimes. It was other people who would bring it up who had no idea that I'd even be sympathetic to it, except that I sort of seemed like a sympathetic and open-minded guy, right? So I came to believe that Jewish power, even in the left, is very, very thin. I think their power is worldwide. It's an ocean wide, but it's only a few millimeters deep, right? And that a hot, sunny day can dawn and it'll dry up very quickly. And therefore, Jewish organizations like the Anti-Defamation League, which I thought were, in the past, were sort of massively overfunded and comically hysterical about the threat of anti-Semitism, I came to believe that, no, these people know how thin their power is, and they are working at 99% capacity.
Yeah, Gilad Atzmon, the Israeli-born saxophonist and philosopher, defines Jewish power as the capacity to stop us talking about Jewish power.
Exactly.
And if we just talk about it, like Dieudonné, the beauty of Dieudonné is that the more he mocks them and the more he gets persecuted, the more his claims about the organized Jewish community are vindicated, because he basically violates Jewish exceptionalism and questions Jewish victimhood and Jewish victimology, and says, well, you've projected this image of Jews as the underdogs, but really you're not the underdogs. You're the most successful ethnic group in French society. And then the more he gets persecuted, the more he's proven right, and it all just becomes all the more funnier, right?
Right.
And I think there's a lot of truth to what you say. And I think that it's a problem on the left that you can meet people who are aware of this stuff in private. And it strikes me that if you're a leftist, like the raison d'etre of the left is to be against ethnic nationalism and ethnic parochialism. And I don't understand what's inconsistent with a leftist analysis with calling out Zionism and calling out Jewish power in America. If the media in the United States has become ethnicized, why is criticizing that taboo and incompatible with being a good leftist? Surely that would be your bread and butter if you were a leftist. But there seems to be this unwarranted philo-Semitism on the left. I think if Jews do good things, if individual Jews do exemplary things that better humanity, then they should be commended. But I also believe that when Jews do bad things, they should be condemned. And it seems that the left is only willing to do the former and not the latter, which is why the left is so irrelevant. And it's why I found myself sort of coming as a refugee to your website, where you actually have original thinkers and you're coming up with critiques which are actually relevant. I think what's happened with the Marxist left is they've basically become irrelevant. And one of the things you have here in Canada especially is these anti-racist groups which go around and like try and sort of enforce anti-hate speech laws or expose so-called haters, so they can, and kind of seem to, as leftists, to be working with the authorities to root out white supremacists, quote unquote, and other people who question Jewish exceptionalism. And so the left has just become really degraded and has dropped the ball on so many issues that people like myself have looked for genuine thinkers like yourself, and that's why I'm grateful for all the work you do. I was gonna ask you now, could you sort of perhaps discuss your ideal society in terms of its structure? Because I know you've said that the defining characteristic of the right is support for inegalitarianism, whereas the left supports egalitarianism. And I've heard you quote Plato's idea of proportionate equality. So to defend unequalness or inegalitarian social dispensations is controversial, is not the norm these days. There's, that it seems that if you're gonna be against war and against injustice, you have to be an egalitarian. But that's not the case with you, is it, Greg?
No, I'm not an egalitarian. However, I do believe that it's not really wise to lead with anti-egalitarianism or elitism, for the simple reason that there's nothing necessarily good about inequality. There's nothing necessarily good about elitism. But there is something necessarily good about justice. Justice is one of those things that, by definition, is a good thing. However, I do believe that justice leads to inegalitarian outcomes. And so what I am primarily for is justice. And I think that a consequence of treating people justly is that there will be unequal outcomes. Why? Because people are not equal, right? People are dramatically different in terms of their innate abilities, their gifts, and they're dramatically unequal in terms of their hard work and enterprise and things like that. And I think that because of that, if you treat unequal people equally, if you try and force equal outcomes on unequal people, you're doing violence to them. William Blake said that one law for the ox and the lion is oppression, and I agree with that. If you're trying to create same outcomes for different peoples. However, I don't believe that inequality should be disproportionate to real merit. Okay, and this is Aristotle's view. Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, has a discussion of distributive justice, where he's talking about the criteria for justly distributing society's rewards. Right. And he says that since people are unequal, they should be treated unequally. Merit should be rewarded more than lack of merit, obviously. However, when you have a situation where the rewards are wildly disproportional to the difference between people, then you have disproportionate, inequality. If somebody is 10 times better and has 100 times more money than, the lowest paid employee in his company or whatever, that is unjust, right? And so Aristotle believed in treating unequal people unequally, but in proportion to their inequality, in proportion to their real merit. And I think that if you had that notion of justice, but what you would have is a society where there is definitely inequality and there's definitely a hierarchy in society, and yet it would be a just inequality, and it would be a just hierarchy. There are lots of hierarchies that are unjust and totally arbitrary in society today and in societies in the past. I'm not defending that. I'm not defending unjust forms of inequality. But I do believe that if you hold to an idea of justice that recognizes that people are unequal and that does not try and basically in some Procrustean way force the same outcomes upon them, that you're going to have a society where there are going to be just hierarchies and just inequalities. And I think that the thing that really separates the left and the right, as I define the right, is that the left is de facto extremely elitist and extremely inegalitarian. The biggest snobs I've ever known have been leftists. And some of the most hateful people I've known are leftists, for that matter. And yet they're dishonest about it. Right?
Yeah, the left is very elitist these days. One characteristic of postmodernism, which is the sort of ideology du jour in the academy on the left at least, is that it has all these sort of jargon phrases which are completely unfathomable to the layman, right? And one thing you find with neo-Marxism is it's extremely elitist, and it almost has this Jewish chosenness that's established itself in dominant leftist ideas. And they sort, the idea of the Marxists was, we have this vanguard who are enlightened, and we're going to enlighten the masses to our worldview. So it has this very elitist, very God's chosen people-esque characteristic. It seems to me that a lot boils down to the mindset of the ruling class in a society. And you see in many feudal systems, there's an idea of noblesse oblige, the idea that the nobility have some obligation to those lower down in society. And it boils down to organic elites versus parasitic elites, and that we live in a society where the elite is here to rip us off, to send us to fight their wars, and they only feel obligation to their in-group and not to the body politic, right? And so it pretty much boils down to that, yes, hierarchical society is kind of inevitable. There's always going to be a division of labor in a society, but if the ruling class have benevolence and have a benevolent mindset, then things will go in the right direction, and justice will be realized. But if you have a ruling class which is parasitic and which is a hostile elite group, then you're going to end up in the situation we're in today, right?
Exactly. I think that one of the things that mutes exploitative elites is kinship between the elites and the masses, right? If you have an elite that is organically connected to the masses, if they're one people and they have a sense of peoplehood, there is a sense of obligation there. I think another thing that is necessary to make sure that the elites are responsive to the interests of the whole body politic is a certain democratic or popular element to government. Aristotle made this argument very effectively, I think, in his Politics, that the common good is really the law of society. And you can have all kinds of constitutional arrangements that aim at the common good. You can have a single man who rules for the common good, or you can have a populace ruling for the common good. Or you can have them ruling for their private interests. The best society is a society that has a ruling elite where you have people who are more public-spirited than average running things, right? We want our doctors to be better versed in medicine than us. We want our lawyers to know the law better than us. We want our auto mechanics to know more about cars than us. We recognize that expertise gives authority, confers authority. And there is expertise in politics. There is expertise in rule. And along with that expertise should come a desire to serve the public good, to have a broader notion of one's interests, right? To identify oneself with the whole. Those sorts of people are rare, and they should be valued, and they should be in positions of power. However, it often comes the case, when a ruler loves his son more than he loves his people, right? The only bad thing that I can think of about the Emperor Marcus Aurelius is that he loved his son Commodus more than he loved Rome. And he ended up leaving Rome in the hands of a bad emperor, the first bad emperor in a very long time, right? Yeah. And so what you have to do is you have to have a popular element to government to basically counterbalance the tendencies of ruling elites to think about their own interests more than the body politics. And so Aristotle posits really the idea of checks and balances, a divided regime where you have monarchical, aristocratic, and popular elements, and where they are empowered to perform different functions within the political system that sort of allow them to check and balance one another so that the net outcome of their activities is a regime where the laws serve the common good rather than just the factional interests of one particular group within the society. That's a great idea. That is a notion that was integral in medieval Christian political philosophy. It's something that we need to get back to, and it is something that was really very much a part of classical fascism and National Socialism. It's the idea of creating an organic hierarchical society where there is a sense of obligation to the common good, and where the different levels in society are bound by mutual obligations to one another. And therefore, you have a hierarchy, but the potentiality for exploitation and injustice within a hierarchy is controlled by, again, being organically related, being part of one people, but also there are certain mechanisms that can be put in place to check and balance the abuses of either popular power or elite power.
Yeah, so we're at the end of the show, Dr. Greg Johnson. Thanks so much for laying out your perspective on a whole range of issues in this show. I'm sure most of the listenership will find it highly thought-provoking, and recognize that people like you in the Western world are thrown in jail for having perspectives like this. We have state-enforced philo-Semitism, state-enforced political correctness in the West. Luckily, you're in the United States, which just about has the First Amendment still. Would you like to tell the listeners how they might be able to contact you, a little bit about the website in about 30 seconds for us, Greg?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me on, first of all. This has been a real pleasure.
Likewise.
If you want to get in touch with me, go to countercurrents.com. That's counter-currents.com. My email address is editor@counter-currents.com. I urge you to check out Countercurrents. We have new material online 5 days a week. And I also would encourage you to check out my book. I have 2 books, the most recent being New Right versus Old Right, and the earlier one being Confessions of a Reluctant Hater. So again, Joshua, thank you so much for the opportunity to reach your audience, and I hope that I hear back from some of them.
Yes, thanks so much, Greg, for coming on the show. So that's this week's show, ladies and gentlemen. Dr. Greg Johnson of Countercurrents Publishing.